India is the second biggest military in the world by overall number of active personnel. Russia comes in fifth. Russian air forces do have more combat planes, and the Russian ground army has more heavy weapon systems. But this video will not just list all the equipment both sides have. It will also try to depict how they would both fare in a conflict, one against the other. Let this arena war analysis commence! A message from Binkov's team first. We've thoroughly revamped our Patreon page, so we believe it now offers some serious additional value. Every patron, regardless of tier, will get access to our videos without any ads. Pure Binkov. Our second tier will also get access to a monthly poll, where our patrons will vote on several topics and pick the winning one, to be made into a Binkov's video. Anyway, if you want to check out what our Patreon offers, there's a link below this video, in the description section. Let's go back to our arena war. Mind you, the naval conflict is outside the scope of this video. Since Russia and India don't share a border, the conflict will be over a hypothetical generic piece of land. Sure, that's not realistic, but neither would a real war between Russia and India be. The piece of land over which the two will fight is basically an area of Kazakhstan, with a roughly similar geography, vegetation, etc. Both militaries will start some 1300 miles apart and will have to cross the lands, occupy the territory and the few urban centers there are, modeled after Kazakhstan. There are no nukes used, both sides enjoy a similar morale and there is no outside interference. When it comes to military expenditure, the two are quite evenly matched, according to the two leading sources in that field. Of course, those figures only give a rough picture. As always with defense expenditures, the context is key. Indian professional soldiers are less paid. India does have more personnel overall. Its working wages are smaller, so personnel expenditure is lower per person. But it buys a lot of equipment abroad, especially from the US, at fairly steep prices. Russia makes its equipment domestically and can procure it at cheaper rates. So what did all that money secure for each side? India's economic situation and huge population allows it to have an all-volunteer force, basically a low-paid professional soldier force, with possibly low motivation, but that's outside the scope of this video. The Indian armed services are 50% larger overall. When it comes to ground army maneuver troops, marines and airborne troops, the disparity in numbers is even bigger. Yet when those two large armies would start moving one towards another, actual combat effectiveness would not only depend on numbers, but a myriad of other factors. Each military unit would need ample support, not just to wage war, but also simply to sustain itself and to effectively, in time, receive resources as it moves through the battlefield. If all other variables are considered equal, for simplicity's sake, then the ratio of combat unit personnel to other support personnel shows how much more support each side can count on. Both sides appear to have a roughly equal ratio at first. But the thing is, they don't use the same common denominator. While the command and support elements are already counted within the Indian army, for the Russian army a good portion of those are part of a separate force organization. When 40% of those are added to the Russian army, it becomes more obvious the Russian units could rely on greater logistical support. A look at the heavy equipment both armies are using makes that argument even more clear. India is ahead in sheer number of tanks by some 12%, but Russian tanks are on average somewhat more capable. And when it comes to other armored combat vehicles, it becomes evident the Russian maneuver units can count on much greater organic firepower and a number of vehicles with sensors. Basically, most Indian army units are simply infantry units with very little added firepower, and they would have to be transported around in various trucks. In practice, that means that if they would have to advance over a risky part of the front line, they would have to do it on foot. Russian forces are all not just motorized but can rely on armored protection, with 3 times more vehicles that have a medium caliber gun and a sensor. When it comes to artillery support, the numbers seem similar, but the quality edge is still on the Russian side. More of their artillery is self-propelled and of a larger caliber. The Russians could also to some degree count on the vast stocks of ex-Soviet vehicles and guns that are stored. Even if just 10% of those could be restored and given to mobilized conscripts, they could be useful. Refurbishing more than 10 or so percent would be implausible. A lot of those weapons are very old and have not been stored in dry conditions. And to properly man an additional 40,000 vehicles or guns would require training of another 500,000 soldiers, more than doubling the existing Russian ground troops. When it comes to actual reservists, the situation is a bit murky. There's an obligation to serve in both armed forces, so some theoretic totals of reservists can seem very high. But only a small part of those forces actually either undergo periodic retraining or have been freshly discharged from the army, so they don't need much training. Russia, for example, maintains arms for some 13 additional motorized brigades. So both sides would rush forward on the battlefield, but the fairly few roads, compared to the vast area, would benefit the Russian side much more, as lots of their vehicles are designed for off-road conditions. Their bigger support units would also mean the Russians would likely move at a greater average speed, compared to the Indians. Of course, the air power of both sides would try to impede the other side's movement. Airstrikes on columns of vehicles, especially on roads, could create serious traffic jams. The Russian air forces are larger, though both sides still use some planes that date from the Cold War. India did receive a few advanced Rafale aircraft at the end of 2019, but the first unit is not likely to be completed and active before 2021. Russian Su-57 is also not yet in service. Given the size of the battlefield, it's likely neither side would see much combat at the very start of the war. Russia does have a bit more long-range platforms, so sporadic ground strikes would be possible even from the start, and more aerial tankers would also help. Russian bombers might also initially expend dozens or hundreds of long-range missiles. As some civilian airports are captured and as new air bases are constructed closer to the enemy, the air war would start to rage in earnest. Indian Sukhoi pilots do tend to fly higher hours than the average of Russian air forces, but other older plane pilots fly similar hours to the Russians. The Russians do have more AWACS-type planes, which would help coordinate air combat over the front lines from safe distances. Overall, the two sides would be fairly evenly matched in the air if combat happened away from both sides' ground forces. In the long run, the Russian fighter jets being 40% more numerous and the slight Russian AWACS edge would likely see India slowly going on the defensive, not able to use their air forces for offensive missions. But all that assumes air combat over no man's land. In reality, most of the air combat would happen either over Indian or Russian-controlled territory, where each side would have their air defenses present. And Russian air defenses are considerable. Just counting the modern systems, Russia has over 10 times as many of them, and they're of much greater reach, covering a far bigger area. Russia also has over 50% more Cold War-era systems, which are also greater in reach. Short-range systems again show large Russian numerical superiority. Very short-range systems such as Strela are not accounted for, though. Russian precision strike-capable planes are 50% more numerous as well, so larger Russian air defenses would have less targets to worry about, while less plentiful Indian SAM batteries would have more on their mind. All that would basically mean that Indian airstrikes would seldomly succeed without grave casualty rates. In the long run, the Indian Air Force would likely not be able to provide support from the air, nor go deep behind enemy lines to continually disrupt Russian logistics. While the Russian Air Force still lacks the numbers to properly do both of those jobs, it would be better at it, with fewer casualties overall. Cruise missile and ballistic missile arsenals are only a small part of both sides' offensive power and wouldn't be crucial. Still, Russia does pull ahead there as well. Eventually, the two large masses of soldiers would meet, probably somewhere closer to the Indian starting point, as Russia would be quicker to deploy their forces. Russia would thus be able to choose a little better where to draw their lines. They could make use of urban centers or forests to suit their forces, depending on their composition. Russian force mobility extends to the air mobility sector as well. They have a roughly 5 times greater transport plane capacity and 20% greater transport helicopter capacity, even though their army is several times smaller. Those aircraft would help move supplies for some of the fastest progressing troops on the front, and would occasionally be an option for moving some of the more elite troops over the front where possible. When it comes to the units trained for airborne ops and helicopter assault, Russians far outstrip the Indian capability. After the Cold War, the Russian military had to downsize from Soviet numbers quite a bit. For example, the Soviet army was over 10 times larger than today's Russian army. But when it comes to the airborne corps, its size was only halved. Still, while Indians would likely cover less than half of the territory by the time two armies meet, their land power would still be considerable. Remember, they have roughly 4 times as many ground troops. If the battlefield was very large, Russian mobility could somewhat maneuver around those numbers. But on a smaller battlefield, like the one mentioned at the start of this video, the concentration of forces would be such that no large part of the front would be without India having several times more soldiers. They would have a hard time progressing though. Without the air power advantage and with less firepower in terms of artillery and fewer medium caliber guns organic to the brigades, the Indian forces would find themselves under constant barrage when exposed in an offensive. Russians would have a different problem. They could count on some but not too much air power, and their ground-based fire support would be somewhat better. But the sheer numbers of the enemy would mean that even if they wipe out a whole unit, another one would take its place. Russia does have a significant edge in attack helicopters, but those probably wouldn't do much on their own, save to blunt any possible Indian mass tank assault. To wage war, one needs to know where enemy forces are. On a more strategic scale, various aerial and satellite assets are usually used for that role. Satellites-wise, the disparity in numbers is not that big. For the ground battle, most of the recon work would actually be done by various drones and manned recon aircraft. India does possess a sizable recon drone advantage, though such drones would not be able to operate close to Russian air defenses and hope to survive for long. The western part of the battlefield, where there is desert terrain, would be hard on both sides, but more so on the Indian side if it wants to be mobile. The Russians might want to try and take advantage of their mobility edge and perhaps quickly reconcentrate some of their forces there, creating a temporary numerical parity or even a localized numeric superiority via a massive airborne assault, helping the armored push. Still, we're talking about 1,000 Indian troops per 1 mile of front line on average. Of course, the actual distribution would be less uniform. The Russians would on the other hand be hard-pressed to make any progress in urban areas or forest areas, such as ones on the eastern side of the battlefield, where the heavy equipment and mobility edge would mostly be annulled by said surroundings. An Indian numerical superiority would perhaps even mean the Indians might slightly push the front north. The whole front is unlikely to move very much overall though. Even if the Russians do break the Indian line here or there with a temporary concentration of firepower and numbers, before India can react, the Russian bulge would quickly find itself surrounded and exposed from both west and east. While the Indians would be unlikely to advance much and/or quickly due to less logistic support their units enjoy, the Russians would be stopped by sheer Indian numbers. In trying to break those numbers, the Russians may be forced to press on in such a way that the loss ratio would favor the Indians. Seeing how the Russians are behind in numbers anyway, that's not a viable long-term strategy. It is thus most likely the war would become a stalemate. Within a year, Russia might take advantage of some of the old Soviet weapon stocks. Even making just a part of them work would mean perhaps another 50,000 reservist troops decently equipped with tanks, fighting vehicles and artillery. Indians would be behind there, as their initial added reservist units would very much be light infantry, transported by simple trucks. With little expertise, those reservists would be thrown into the war grinder, not making as much difference as a professional soldier could. Still, it's plausible Russia might move the front line a little bit more towards the Indian side over a longer period. The Indian Air Force would most likely play defensively. It absolutely can't afford to lose planes to Russian air defenses. And as long as it can deny most of its airspace to Russian planes, which it can due to its fairly advanced planes and sufficient numbers, as well as the fact the attacker would lack the same level of situational awareness in enemy territory due to fewer radars, it could keep the Russian Air Force in check. If, however, it loses its air forces in headless attacks on Russian Air Force and air defenses, the Russians could use their remaining assets to aid the ground effort. Even the Russian bomber force, which would otherwise be confined to standoff missile strikes as it's too vulnerable to do much else, could suddenly be a serious factor. 130 bombers doing carpet bombing runs might wreak havoc on Indian morale. But realistically, the Indians would be using their population advantage and mobilizing several times more units than the Russians. Even if poorly equipped, India would still possess enough fire support and air defenses to blunt most Russian attacks. That front line would be moving very slowly towards the Indian side. Would things change much by year 2? Not likely. While the Indian economy is 2 to 3 times bigger by GDP, switching that into an actual war effort advantage would be hard. The Indian industrial sector is not that much bigger than Russia's, and Russia has kept a lot of their Cold War arms industry and capitalized on it. The Indian arms industry is less advanced and smaller in size. A lot of Indian planes and tanks, for example, are Russian-sourced. Without support, especially the planes would likely experience maintenance issues, as the Indian aerospace sector still doesn't make 100% of the parts for those planes. While India could try and further source arms from other countries, purchases of complex systems take years to materialize, without help from outside governments. India could not afford to buy expensive Western systems with its GDP and hope to outmatch the Russian systems, which would be domestically sourced. The stalemate on the front might go on. Of course, the front position would, during all of the war, be somewhat in Russia's favor. Casualties, though, are another story. Even if the Russians could maintain a 1-to-1 loss ratio, losing 200,000 troops, for example, would not hit both sides the same. In a very long war, a multi-year war, India might still have a chance to start pushing the Russian forces up north. It all depends on the morale of both sides, which is something that's impossible to quantify even for starting positions, let alone 3 or 4 years into a war. Special thanks goes to Son of Cyrus for his support. Check out his cool Binkov merch, available via the link in the video description below. And remember, Binkov may talk about hypothetical wars, but only real peace can bring us all together.